When we talk in broad terms about bargaining strategies, and we talk about a hard or a soft strategy, we're talking in a fairly abstract way. Whereas as bargainers, we actually have to be quite specific. We have to think about what it is precisely that we want, and we have to be fairly clear about what it is that our principals expect from us, what our most ambitious target might be that we can realistically hope to attain, and we have to know with quite a good degree of certainty what our absolute minimum settlement point will be before we start to get into real trouble with our principals. So when we're planning a bargaining situation, when we're planning our strategies for bargaining, we have to start to put some meat onto the bones of what a hard or a soft bargaining strategy might look like. We have to think in concrete terms rather than abstract terms about what that might be. Now, for many bargainers, their sense of what these target and resistance points might be will be arrived at implicitly, because they're so imbued in the life of the organization. They know their principles, they may have been doing this for years, they know the history, they know what the settlement range tends to be. They can just pull all of these things as if out of thin air. But of course, what they're actually doing is making use of a lot of tacit knowledge to fill in the gaps and to work around the politics and the levels of acceptability. But they're doing it implicitly. They're not consciously doing it. There is a way of making sense of what is going on beneath the hood, if you like. If we can take off the head of a bargain and look inside at what the process might be, what things they're taking into consideration, and tease out those elements. And this is one of the things that Walton and McCarthy did in their study of employment relations bargainers, and attempt to unpick the various things that they're taking into account when they're planning their bargaining and when they're setting their target and resistance points for their bargaining activities. So we're going to look at how they did this and see if we can use some of those ideas to help us make sense of how to plan our bargaining before we get to the point where we can do it implicitly, as if by magic. So this is a complex and sophisticated process. The judgment of bargainers in this, like I say, is often guided by all kinds of historical and tacit knowledge. Some of it is calculated, some of it is explicit. And the concept that Walton and McCarthy use in order to make sense of how hard a bargainer should attempt to get a particular settlement point is one that they call subjectively expected utilities. So we've talked about utility before, how useful a particular bargaining outcome would appear, how much we want a thing. But this is taking it a little bit further on. It's about subjectively expected utilities. So it combines with this idea of usefulness or utility the idea that, well, we don't just want to achieve a bargaining outcome, but we also have to think about the probability of being able to get that thing. Just how likely is it that we're going to be able to achieve it. We also have to take into account how much we're likely to have to suffer pain. How much is it going to cost us to get this thing? Because that's a trade-off as well. We might ultimately achieve this outcome, but to do that, if we have to suffer an awful lot of pain, and there's an absolute certainty we're going to suffer that pain to get there, the trade-off might be regarded as too much. And so we have to take that into account. And we not only, in doing all of those things, we not only have to think about what we want and how likely is it that we're going to suffer pain, but in doing that, we have to be able to think about from our opponent's point of view as well. In order to understand how much somebody's going to resist what we want, we have to understand how the issue looks from their point of view. We can also undertake the exact same process in reverse as well, to try and make a judgment about what our bargaining opponent wants from the negotiation. What are their aims going to be? We might know that they want to negotiate about issue X or issue Y, but once we can start to think about what the parameters might be, we can start to plot out what their target and resistance points might be, which allows us to get an idea about what the settlement range might end up being, which is a huge advantage from the point of view of a bargainer going into a negotiation. So, Walter McKenzie unpack this concept of subjective expected utilities. And what they find as being part of this concept is that for any issue, we need to take the utility or usefulness of that thing, and we multiply it by the probability of its acceptance by our opponents. So it's not just do we want this thing, but how likely are we of getting it? What's the likelihood of us getting this thing that we want? But then we also have to add into the equation the costs of getting what we want. Now, how do we quantify the costs? You know, it's very difficult to quantify that is. In a sense, the cost of an industrial dispute, you know, it's very difficult to quantify. But we can put a figure on that. So we think about the costs of getting what we want, just as a stand-in for how painful this thing is going to be. And then we have to multiply that by the chance of incurring those costs. And then when we put all of these figures together, we can identify across a range of settlement points the overall subjective expected utility for each one of those settlement points. So we might start out thinking that the thing to aim for is the thing that provides us with the most utility. But when we add in all of the other elements, the probability of getting it, chance of incurring costs as part of the process of getting that, it may end up being a very bad idea to attempt that our target point should be nowhere near that maximum settlement because it's not optimal. We're looking for our optimal areas of settlement. And maybe a little bit beyond that, if we can stretch ourselves, what our target might be, and a little bit below that, what our resistance point might be. So we go through this point by point. So we start out, let's say it's a pay negotiation, and we're negotiating around a percentage rate increase. And we might start out at the bottom and say, well, what would it mean for us if we were to achieve a 0% increase, a pay freeze? Now, how much we want that, it's a utility for us, we might regard that as zero. That is absolutely not what we want. That's going to look terrible for us going back to our members. We're going to look like rotten negotiators, and that's the last thing in the world that we want to go. And that as we go up in these kind of steps, so a 2.5% increase, well, that might be seen as a reasonable outcome. Depends upon the settlement ranges in the relevant markets. 2.5%. Some years might be okay. Sometimes it might be brilliant. And we could push this all the way up to whatever our notional maximum might be. In this fanciful example, you know, back in the days when we used to get pay increases like this, a 15% increase, and we might regard that as having, you know, the biggest utility, 6 on the scale. That's the top end of what we want. So we can figure out how much do we want these settlement points, from 0 up to 6. We then have to think about the probability of achieving that. Now, one way of thinking about the probability is to put ourselves in the heads of our bargaining opponents. So the probability of us getting any particular settlement is going to reflect the degree of disutility opponents. So for a 0% pay increase, we may regard that as an absolute certainty. Of course, we can go in and get a 0% increase because it doesn't require any movement from them. And unless they're actually wanting a pay cut, that represents a racing certainty. So we can give that a probability of 1. We can definitely get a 0% increase. And we may go up the scale, and at our top end, it may have maximum utility, but actually, we are never going to get a 15% increase. It has so much disutility from our opponent's point of view that we simply can't get it. So the first part of the equation is fairly straightforward. If utility multiplied by the probability of getting it, and we end up with the first set of totals, or first column of totals in this process. We then have to add in the costs. So our costs are standard. Let's just say our costs are the cost of a withdrawal of labour, the cost of running a strike, and we put this as -2. It's a negative figure in a sense. It doesn't really make that much difference. And then we start to think about the probability of having to incur those costs. So the probability of having to incur those costs is a function of the probability of getting the agreement over the settlement point in question. So if we think about that 0% increase again, we know that there was 100% certainty of being able to achieve that outcome. So because there's 100% certainty of getting it, there's a 0% chance of incurring costs. At the other end of the scale, the 0% chance of achieving a 15% increase is reflected in a 100% chance of incurring costs in attempting to achieve that outcome. So we're as certain as we can be that we aren't going to get that, and if we try to get it, we are going to have to run a strike. We're going to have to incur those costs to get it. And the other settlement points kind of shade from one end of that scale to the next. So when we get that second total and we add it to the first total, we end up with a range of subjective expected utilities for each one of those settlement points. Now, when we run that through, if we aim for a 0% pay increase, in the first column we had 0, in the second column we had 0, and so the overall subjectively expected utility for a 0% increase is 0. If we go to the other end of the scale, and we think about that fanciful 15% increase, we ended up with a 0%, a 0 in the first column, because it was 0 chance of getting it. So whatever the utility, it's not going to happen. So whatever the utility multiplied by 0 is 0. But there was a 100% chance of incurring the cost. So 1 times -2 equals -2, plus the 0 from the first column equals an overall subjective expected utility of -2. Now that tells us that it'd actually be worse to go for our maximal bargaining objective. 15% pay increase would actually be worse than it would be to go for a 0% increase because of the impact of certainty of incurring those strike costs. But the other figures in between those points tell a more interesting story. We kind of know implicitly that is going to be not a reasonable bargaining objective to pursue. But some of the other figures are more interesting. So say if we go to the 2.5% increase, we end up with in the final column with a subjective expected utility of 0.7. At 5%, 1.2. 7.5%, 0.75. Then as soon as we go a little bit higher, we're back down into the negative territory at 0.6, and then minus 1.25, and then, as we said already, -2 for the 15%. Now, what's interesting is that between the 2.5% settlement point and 0, there's a big fall off. You know, that goes from there's no utility for us doing, there's no SEU at all to 0.7. And at the other end, we go from the 7.5% settlement with an SEU of 0.75 down to 0.6. There's a real divergence. Now, what these divergences tell us is that there's something significant. They represent kind of boundaries about the overall utility, the subjective expected utility of these bargaining points. And that either side of those, the utilities fall away quite dramatically. Which tells us if we want to try and optimize our bargaining objectives, we ought to be thinking about these as realistic limits, because either side of that, the advantage of pursuing them just drops away quite significantly. The optimal approach to take, which balances benefits against costs most effectively, is the 5% increase with an SEU of 1.2. Now, this then it helps us to determine our bargaining range. What our resistance point is. We don't want to be accepting anything less than 2.5, because once we drop below that, things start dropping away very fast. We don't want to target anything beyond 7.5, because beyond that, things start dropping away quite substantially. So it really helps us to make sense of our own bargaining position. Now, of course, we can attempt this on the other side as well. It's going to be much more difficult to be accurate to some extent because we don't know what they're thinking. But we do know what our resistance to some of their objections might be. So we can think about how much probability we can enter into the equations with a bit more accuracy. But it really allows us to start to sketch out the bargaining positions. It allows us to make sense of the bargaining terrain. And we can supplement and add on to these models as we go through, and we're keeping an eye out, we're keeping a sharp ear for clues about what they're telling us about, and we can change our figures as we go along to fine-tune our bargaining positions and to engage in ways which allows us to plan effectively and to target our efforts and make our commitments in ways that are going to be the most effective that they can be.